Hello and welcome. Today we will talk about performance management in organizations. Performance management in performance appraisals are extremely critical for any organization. So let's start with a definition of performance management, which is the process of measuring, communicating, and managing employee performance in the workplace so the performance is aligned with organizational strategies. So key elements of performance management would be to measure, to communicate, and to manage the overall employee performance in the workplace in a strategic manner. How does that differ from performance appraisal? Performance appraisal is the process of measuring employees' performance using predetermined criteria and sharing this information with the employee on a regular basis. So performance appraisal data is usually used in the reward process, reward distribution, identification of potential employees for promotion, for training, for even transfer, for sometimes layoff or terminations. Some organizations tend to have a performance appraisal process every few months. Some organizations have them once a year. But obviously the goal is to communicate with the employees as often as possible. So the more formal appraisal process you can have on a regular basis, the better off. Nonetheless, as a manager, you should not wait for the formal appraisal process to communicate performance deficiencies with employees. The more immediately after the performance that you communicate with the employees regarding the performance, the better off you will be, the better off the employee will be, and the better off your relationship as employee and manager will be, in the high level of trust that obviously would exist between you and your employees. So the main objective of performance appraisal would be to provide employees feedback, whether it's formal or informal. The key is to get that done as quickly as possible and on a regular basis. Another objective of performance appraisal would be development and problem solving with your employees. Sometimes they're HR related, like promotions, demotions, and transfers, even pay raises or furloughs in some cases that unfortunately we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic era. However, another major objective of performance appraisals would be data analytics. So the importance of high quality data and performance metrics cannot be overemphasized. So keep track of all the data, all performance related issues, and be objective and be fair in all of your performance metrics by using a methodical or systematic process with all of your employees. You do this to be fair and obviously to make improvements between you and your employees in the department, but also you do this because of legal reasons. Being objective, being accurate, and having regularly collected performance metrics can be very useful in defending against costly lawsuits in the court of law. So the goal is to be legally compliant in all circumstances. What are the challenges in performance management when it comes to remote working settings, those employees who are telecommuters or working from their home offices? The goal is to apply proper and situation-based performance appraisals with all of them. Regardless of whether your workers are working from their home office as teleworkers or gig workers, or they're coming in to the office on a full-time basis, there are certain characteristics associated with an effective performance management process. They have to be aligned with your overall strategy. They have to be fair. They have to be accurate. And they have to be practical. And practicality means that they're aligned with the situational factors associated with your workers, whether they're working from home, from the office, or from an office that is far removed from your current location. Think about those who are working internationally. So a good performance measuring metric or device would take the situation of every employee into consideration. When it comes to designing certain features of a good performance management system, there are three considerations or approaches for measurement of performance in any organization. First, you can use the trait appraisal approach. You can use the behavioral appraisal approach, or you can use the results-based appraisal approach. Let's look at each of these a bit more closely. The trait appraisal process focuses on measuring employees' different attributes such as dependability, helpfulness, and product knowledge. The advantage is that it's fairly simple to use. However, the drawback is that there are going to be more rater errors associated with the trait approach, and it is not always as accurate as it should be because it describes the person and not necessarily the behavior. The behavioral appraisal process assesses the frequency with which employees tend to demonstrate specific behaviors at work. It is very useful for feedback purposes between you and the employee. However, it may not be possible to create a list of all the behaviors that tend to capture high performance in any organization. But nonetheless, if you do know certain behaviors that are critical for the success of any employee, then you tend to measure those using the behavioral appraisal process. The third approach is results-based appraisal, where you define performance in terms of the outcomes of a job. The advantage is that it's very objective. The numbers are usually measurable and observable and metrics driven. However, the difficulty is that the results that you are measuring are not necessarily always under the control of the employee due to various situations and circumstances. So some aspects of performance may not be measurable, and all the elements may not be controlled by the employee. You can also use goal setting, and one of the approaches would be MBOs, or management by objectives, which is a management strategy where organizational goals are translated into departmental goals, which are then converted into individual level goals to make sure that the individual and company goals or objectives are actually aligned together. So use MBOs between your employees and your department goals to make sure there's alignment between what they do and what is achieved on a monthly, weekly, or daily basis. In the management by objective process, usually you review the organizational objectives, you set employee objectives, you communicate those with the employees, obviously, you monitor the performance, you evaluate the performance, and you give feedback or reward good performance and correct inappropriate performance that is not aligned with the organization's goal or the objectives that you had set out or communicated and agreed upon jointly between you and your employees. One of the concerns you should keep in mind with regards to goal setting is to make sure the employees are not involved in unethical behaviors. And sometimes employees are too narrowly focused on one or two objectives to where they become demotivated to learn other things in the organization. So when it comes to choosing a rating method, let us look at the absolute rating method as well as its drawbacks, and the relative rating method, along with qualitative approaches to selecting which method might be appropriate for you in your department. So as you can see in the absolute, relative, and qualitative approaches, there are positives and then there are drawbacks. In the absolute rating method, you compare the performance to the established standards that exist within the department. However, lack of differentiation could be problematic, where you may not be able to actually see clearly the performance of the employee to what was the standard. In the relative ranking method, you compare the individual to other employees in the organization. It can be useful for decision-making purposes because it forces raters to differentiate between two employees. However, the drawback is that the relative method forces the rater to differentiate between employees even when differences do not really exist. It also can be less useful for human resource analytics. On the other hand, the qualitative approach eliminates all numerical ratings and focuses on feedback content. So it can be useful for feedback purposes by eliminating unnecessary conflicts. However, it does or it could increase uncertainty regarding where the employee actually stands. It may simply mean that the real rating occurs behind closed doors. And also, it's less useful for human resource analytics purposes. So when you're evaluating employees, where do we get our information from? Well, you can get it from managers, from coworkers, from customers, from self-assessment of employees, as well as the 360-degree feedback from employees, coworkers, teammates, customers, suppliers, vendors, and superiors, if it's more than one manager that the employee is reporting to. Ultimately, you should teach managers how to be good coaches and how to build trust with your employees during the performance management and performance appraisal processes. These are opportunities between you and your employees to build a strong relationship with each other, to be honest, to be accurate, to be timely with regards to feedback, and to always be objective. As a result, you can establish performance improvement plans, or PIPs, which makes systems more developmental for employees who are poor performers in the organization. And these PIPs, in these performance improvement plans, gives poor performers a fair chance to make improvements. And ultimately, if these poor performers are not able to meet the established standards, then obviously you would make a decision of separation or termination. However, it would not be a surprise to the employee in that case because you've been attempting and regularly communicating with this person in coaching him or her to make improvements. So try to have a very positive performance interview every single time you meet with your employee, but be honest and always be accurate regarding his or her performance. Avoid any of the errors when it comes to performance reviews of your employees. Let's look at some of these errors that could be possible when you are meeting with your employees regarding their performance. Leniency is a manager's tendency to rate most of the employees very high. Severity is a manager's tendency to rate most employees closer to the lower end of the scale. Central tendency would be a manager's tendency to rate most employees closer to the middle of the scale. Halo error is basing performance rating on one or two performance dimensions, where one prominent dimension positively affects how the employee is perceived on all the other dimensions. Horn's error is when the rating on one dimension negatively influences how the employee is perceived on the other dimensions on the scale. Recency error is a rater's focus on the most recent employee behavior that they observed rather than focusing on the entire month, quarter, or year that is related to the performance time period of review. And impression management consists of certain behaviors that employees demonstrate to portray a specific positive image. Be mindful of these errors. Make sure you're not influenced by them, so you can be focused on objective criteria that applies to all employees on a consistent or methodical manner as you evaluate the performance of your employees. As always, build a reputation for being a very objective, very analytic, and very rational professional in every case. And you can do this by analyzing the facts, analyzing the data, analyzing the numbers in each situation so you can make evidence-based decisions. Good luck.